Welcome back, deep divers. Today, we're going to be really taking a look at representation in media and how it all plays into, influencing especially young minds. We're basing this whole deep dive on one video essay, and I think you're going to find the speaker's take on it pretty unique.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The way they talk about it, it's so conversational, and they bring in all these personal experiences that make you really stop and think.
Yeah. It's great. Okay, so right away, they kind of push back against this whole we need more representation thing that we hear so much these days. And to do that, they talk about their own childhood, watching WWE and Dragon Ball Z, and how they never really felt like they needed to see characters that looked exactly like them to, enjoy the shows or feel like they belonged.
Right, and I think that's where that idea of aspiration comes in. It's not about seeing a mirror image of yourself on screen. It's about finding characters that you admire, that you want to be like, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. It's less about seeing yourself and more about seeing qualities you want to have.
Yeah, I see that. They talk about doing John Cena impressions and stuff. It's all about capturing that energy and spirit, right?
Exactly.
So it's not that they're totally against representation or anything. They even bring up the Cosby Show effect, which is, a pretty interesting example of how positive representation can actually make a difference in the real world.
Oh, for sure. That research on the Cosby Show was wild. They found that seeing successful Black families on TV actually had an impact on how many Black students were going to college. That's a pretty huge deal.
Yeah.
But then the speaker, they kind of throw you for a loop.
Yeah, because they go on to compare that positive example with what they see in a lot of media today, which they describe as, they use some pretty strong words, dysfunction, toxicity, even degeneracy.
Right. And that leads to their main point, which is that if you're only relying on media to figure out who you are, that can be a problem, especially if the media itself is messed up. If kids aren't getting a good foundation somewhere else, they might be picking up on messages that aren't really, healthy or helpful.
So where do they think that foundation?
The speaker is all about the power of the family. They really believe that parents should be the main programmers, so to speak, in a kid's life, the ones shaping their values and how they see the world. It's parents should be the strongest influence, not celebrities or influencers or whatever.
Makes sense, especially with all the concerns about media having a negative influence. But then they get into this thing that really got me thinking. They actually question the whole motive behind this push for representation, saying it might be about more than just, reflecting demographics.
Yeah, that was super interesting.
They use this funny example, breaking down the demographics of the U.S. If you had 10 random people in a room, statistically only 1.5 of them would be Black. They're basically pointing out how ridiculous it is to try to apply these strict quotas to everything.
And then they bring up the Transformers movies as an example. They're okay, there are all these Transformer characters in this movie, but in reality, that demographic is super tiny.
Exactly.
So it's what's the deal with that,
Right. And that's when they introduce this idea of bullying through ideology.
Yeah, that's a powerful phrase.
I gotta admit, when I first heard that, I was kind of what? What does that even mean in this context?
Well, it seems like what they're saying is that sometimes this push for representation isn't actually about being inclusive. It's about using it as a way to force a certain worldview or ideology on people. It's about pushing an agenda, even if it means, things aren't really authentic or even pushing other groups aside.
So it's using representation as a weapon almost?
Yeah, that's a pretty strong way to put it, but I think you're getting at what they're trying to say. They're saying that sometimes in the name of diversity, you end up with this forced fake representation that actually makes things less inclusive.
And to show this, they talk about older movies that had diverse casts, but, without any quotas, Heavyweights. The diversity there just felt natural, right?
Exactly. It wasn't about checking boxes or meeting some number. It was just about reflecting the reality of, the world the story was set in. And the speaker's argument is that even though this kind of organic representation might not perfectly reflect every demographic, it feels more real. And in the end, it's actually more inclusive.
So it's not just about numbers, it's about how those numbers are shown, right? And whether it feels forced or genuine. I'm really curious to hear more about how they apply this idea to real life situations. What other examples do they use?
Well, they bring up this one example, the LA Fire Department. And there was this whole thing about making the force more diverse, but it seemed like they were focused on certain groups more than others.
Okay, yeah, I remember hearing about that. What happened?
Well, the speaker mentions this article, and it's like straight, it says that the goal was to make the department less white and less male. And that's kind of, raises some questions.
Yeah, for sure, because if you're trying to be inclusive, shouldn't everyone have the same shot no matter who they are?
Exactly. And it's almost like reverse discrimination, right? Like trying to fix one problem by creating another one.
Yeah.
So what does the speaker think we should do about diversity then if quotas aren't the answer?
That's a really good question.
Well, they don't pretend to have it all figured out, but they bring up those older movies again, like Heavyweights. Remember how the diversity just felt natural?
Right, like the characters just happened to be diverse. It wasn't a big deal or anything. It was.
Exactly. And maybe that's a better way to think about representation in media. Just let it happen naturally instead of trying to force it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And it's not just about media, right? It's about making a world where everyone feels like they belong without having to constantly try to make it happen.
Right. Right. So if we think about the bigger picture for what happens if we get representation, what are the risks? I mean, we talked about the speaker's worries about media having a bad influence, but is there anything else we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the big things is that we might end up with this really shallow kind of diversity. Like instead of getting rid of stereotypes, we actually make them stronger by creating these flat characters who are only defined by their identity.
So it's like checking boxes instead of telling real stories?
Yeah, and that can actually make things worse, right? Because if the only way certain groups are shown is negative or stereotypical, it just reinforces those harmful ideas.
And then people start to believe those stereotypes because they see them everywhere, and that can have real consequences in the real world.
Exactly. It's almost like we're hurting more than helping by trying to force representation that doesn't feel real or authentic.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that people are trying to do good with all this diversity and representation stuff. But like the speaker said, even good intentions can backfire if you're not careful.
Yeah.
And this is where that whole bullying through ideology idea comes in. It's not about saying that all efforts to be more diverse are bad, but it's about being aware of the potential problem and making sure we're not losing authenticity or, individual expression in the process.
Right. In the speaker's own story, growing up watching shows like Dragon Ball Z and WWE, it shows how powerful it can be to see yourself in characters you admire, even if they don't have the exact same background or identity as you.
Yeah, it's about finding characters who have qualities you want to have no matter what they look like or where they come from.
And that's a really important message for young people. It's about focusing on what you can control, like your own actions and choices and how you want to live your life, instead of feeling limited by this idea of perfect representation.
That reminds me of something else the speaker mentioned about the influence of social media, especially on young people. They were talking about all these transformations happening and kind of implied that social media might be playing a role in how people see themselves and normalizing certain choices.
It's so interesting, right? So social media can be awesome for connecting with people and expressing yourself, but it can also make you feel like you have to be a certain way to fit in.
It's like if everyone you follow is suddenly embracing the specific identity or lifestyle, it can make you feel like you have to do the same thing just to be accepted. And that can be dangerous, especially for young people who are still figuring things out.
It's important to remember that social media is just a highlight reel. It's not real life.
Totally. And I think that's where the speaker's point about how important parents are becomes even more important. If kids are constantly getting hit with all these messages from social media, they need a solid foundation at home to help them deal with all of it.
Yeah, they need parents who are willing to have those tough conversations about what they're seeing and hearing and help them learn to think for themselves.
It's not about shielding them from the world. It's about giving them the tools to understand it.
Right. And it's about setting a good example, too. Kids learn by watching us.
Oh.
So if we're always on our phones or getting worked up about stuff online, they're going to pick up on that.
It's about being aware of how we use media ourselves and making sure we're setting good examples for our kids.
And it's about making a home where everyone feels welcome and respected, not just talking about it, but actually living it.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that real diversity is about more than just who we see on TV or in movies. It's about making a society where everyone feels valued and respected, no matter who they are or where they come from.
It's about making sure everyone has the same opportunities, no matter their race, gender, or anything else.
And that's something we should all be working toward.
Yeah, I totally agree. It really does all come back to that idea of, having that strong foundation at home. If kids are seeing all this stuff on social media, on regular TV, they need something to hold on to, right? Their values, a sense of who they are to help them deal with all those influences.
Totally. It's like the speaker said, parents have got to be the main people shaping their kids' lives, not just leaving it up to whatever's trending or whatever they happen to see on their phone.
And that's a big job, right? I mean, how are parents even supposed to keep up with all this stuff kids are exposed to these days? It's crazy.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not easy, but the speaker does have some advice. It's not about trying to keep kids away from everything. It's about giving them the tools to think for themselves.
So, what does that look like in real life? How do you actually do that?
Well, it starts with actually talking to them, being open and honest about the things they're seeing and hearing, even the tough stuff. And it's not about lecturing or telling them what to think. It's about helping them figure it out for themselves.
So asking questions, making them think about why they believe what they believe, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And it's also about setting a good example, right? Kids learn by watching us. So if we're always glued to our screens or getting, super worked up about stuff online, they're going to notice that.
It's about being aware of how we use media, too, and making sure we're showing them what healthy habits look like.
Right. And creating a home where, everyone feels welcome and respected. And it's not just about saying it, it's about actually doing it.
Walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that real diversity goes way beyond who we see in movies or on TV. It's about making a society where everyone feels valued and respected no matter where they come from or what they look like.
It's about making sure everyone has the same chances to succeed no matter their race or their gender or anything else.
And that's something we should all be working towards, for sure.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I feel like I understand all the complicated stuff about representation so much better now and how it ties into so many other important things.
Yeah, me too. The speaker's perspective is so interesting, and it really makes you think. And it's not about giving easy answers or simple solutions. It's about making us think harder about these issues and approaching them with understanding and empathy.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, especially these days. We need to be having these conversations, even if they're uncomfortable. We need to be willing to challenge our own beliefs and to, really listen to other people's perspectives.
I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about, and hopefully it's given you, the listener, some things to ponder too. We've explored those different sides of the representation debate, the problems with quotas, and how much parents really matter in shaping how their kids see the world.
And as you're out there trying to make sense of it all, we want to leave you with one last question to think about: how can we support real diversity and representation in media and in our communities without, falling into those traps of pushing agendas or limiting how people can express themselves?
It's definitely a complicated issue, but it's one worth exploring further.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something and enjoyed the conversation.
And we hope it gets you talking.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those brains working.